a hull long enough to cover most of a city block, 849,000 pounds sitting on the rail, exhaust leaving the stack at 850 degrees, traveling 150 miles an hour, and bolted inside the cab, a second engine that almost nobody mentions. Union Pacific built the largest locomotive that has ever existed. Then it installed a smaller engine inside that locomotive at the factory 30 separate times. It did that because the big one could not be trusted to move slowly. Have you ever run a machine that was brilliant at exactly one job and useless at everything beside it? Put it in the comments. This is the kind of thing American Ironworks takes apart. Subscribe so you catch the next one. The hidden engine was an 850 horsepower Cooper-Bessemer diesel. On its own, that is a real locomotive. In 1952, a mainline diesel made about 1,500 horsepower, so the engine riding inside had well over half the output of an ordinary locomotive of its day. It sat within a machine rated at 8,500. The specification gives its purpose in one flat line: auxiliary power for starting the turbine and operating the locomotive at low speeds. Read that second half again: operating the locomotive at low speeds. Union Pacific fitted an entire extra power plant because the main one could not handle the slow parts of the job. Not the hard parts, the slow parts. This is the detail that gets me, and it has been sitting in the spec books for 65 years. Everybody talks about how loud these machines were. Almost nobody asks why the loudest locomotive in America needed a quiet one riding along inside it. To understand the answer, you have to understand what Union Pacific was actually running out there. They were called gas turbine-electric locomotives, GTLs. A jet-style turbine spun a generator, the generator fed traction motors, and the motors turned the wheels. No pistons, no crankshaft. One shaft turning and a wall of hot air going out the back. Union Pacific was the only railroad in the United States that ever ran them in regular freight service. Not one other line tried it. 55 machines delivered between 1952 and June of 1961. It did not begin at 8,500 horsepower. It began with one machine and a question. In November of 1948, Alco and General Electric handed Union Pacific a single prototype numbered 50. The railroad tested it for 7 months and liked what it saw. 10 production units followed in 1952, numbered 51 through 60, making 4,500 horsepower each and costing $540,000 apiece. Something like $6.5 million in today's money for a locomotive with no crankshaft anywhere inside it. 15 more arrived in 1954, a batch the crews called verandas for the walkway running down the side of the body. Then, in August of 1958, General Electric started delivering the third generation. Alco had left the partnership by then. 30 machines, numbered 1 through 30, at nearly double the output of anything that came before them. And here is the thing about that hidden second engine. It had been there from the very beginning. The first and second generation machines carried a Cummins donkey engine rated at 250 horsepower, small enough to overlook. When Union Pacific scaled the turbine from 4,500 horsepower up to 8,500, it scaled the hidden diesel right alongside it from 250 horsepower to 850. The problem did not show up when the machines got bigger. It grew with them in proportion, and the railroad went on paying for the workaround instead of fixing what caused it. The last 30 were the ones that mattered. Union Pacific's own words for them, still on the company website today: the largest locomotives ever built. 8,500 horsepower, measured at 6,000 feet of elevation on a 90-degree day, which tells you exactly where these things were meant to work. At sea level, engineers believed the turbine could reach closer to 10,000. The only reason it never did was that the generator behind it would have been torn apart. Sit with that. The engine was governed down to protect the rest of the locomotive from it. Every figure on the sheet reads the same way. 849 Ventagon 212 pounds on the rail, 240,000 pounds of starting tractive effort, combustion at 1,400 degrees, exhaust leaving at 850 degrees and 150 miles an hour, hot enough that crews watched it soften the asphalt under highway bridges. Coupled to its booster unit, one machine measured 165 feet and 11 inches end to end. Every number on that sheet is a number produced by people who had stopped asking whether any of this was reasonable. Railroaders called them big blows, also bird burners. Standing near one at speed, the sound was not a locomotive sound at all. Union Pacific's own words for it are a deafening jet engine exhaust. Continuous tractive effort came to 220,312 pounds. At 18 miles an hour, a big blow was still putting about 146,000 pounds into the drawbar. Top speed was 65. On the 0.82% climb west out of Cheyenne, one of them was rated for 6,740 tons. On the steeper 1.14% grade east out of Ogden, 5,180 tons. One locomotive doing work that would otherwise take 4 or 5 diesels lashed together. The turbines started out on a single stretch of railroad, Ogden to Green River in Wyoming. As Union Pacific gained confidence, the territory widened, Ogden to Laramie, then Ogden to Cheyenne, and by 1955 and 56, all the way through to Council Bluffs, Iowa. That expansion brought a problem of its own. The early units carried 7,200 gallons of fuel aboard, and it was not enough. Union Pacific began coupling dedicated tenders behind them holding 24,000 gallons, and even with that, a big blow had a range of roughly 400 miles. They were tried once on the Salt Lake City to Los Angeles run. Union Pacific's own account of how that went is one sentence long. The noise made them unpopular in California. You will read in a lot of places that California cities banned them outright. I went looking for the ordinance, and there is no city named, no date, and no document behind that claim anywhere I can find. What the railroad itself says is that people did not want them, and the trial ended. So Union Pacific had the most powerful locomotive on Earth, and it worked. Which makes the second engine inside it stranger, not less strange. The answer starts with what it burned. The turbine did not run on diesel, it ran on something closer to tar. Bunker C is what is left at the bottom of the barrel once a refinery has taken everything valuable out of a load of crude. At 50 degrees, it has the consistency of corn syrup. Near freezing, it barely moves at all. Before it could be pumped into the turbine, it had to be heated to 200 degrees, and the tenders carried electric heating elements to do exactly that. There is a decent argument it was never Bunker C at all. Don Strack, who has spent decades inside Union Pacific's records, argues the railroad actually specified a lighter grade, number 5 fuel, thin enough to flow at 95 SUS at 210 degrees. His reading is that half the men on the property were Navy veterans, and every heavy black fuel in the Navy was called Bunker C, so the name attached itself to something it did not belong to. Either way, the point holds. Union Pacific was feeding the most powerful locomotive on Earth a refinery's garbage. The railroad understood the fuel was its exposure and tried to get out from under it. Between May of 1953 and January of 1954, they ran Unit 57 on propane to find out whether a cleaner fuel could do the work. Nothing came of it. And that was the whole business case. In the early 1950s, that heavy residual cost 2 to 2.5 cents a gallon. Diesel fuel cost 10 to 12. The turbine burned roughly twice as much fuel as an equally powerful diesel, and it did not matter in the slightest. When your fuel costs a fifth of what the other man is paying, you can afford to burn twice as much of it and still walk away with the money. This is the part that gets left out of almost every telling of this story. These machines were not a novelty. They were not a stunt that Union Pacific indulged and quietly regretted. In 1956, the railroad put the numbers side by side. The cost of moving 1,000 gross ton miles. Steam came in at $145.14. Diesel, the technology that had just finished killing steam, cost $84 The turbines did it for $69.19. The big blows were the cheapest motive power Union Pacific owned, cheaper than the diesels that had spent the previous decade destroying the steam locomotive. They were not being tolerated. By the middle of the 50s, 25 of them had covered 6 million miles in 4 years. Each machine was averaging around 8,000 miles and 400 hours of running every month, available 78 to 80% of the time. At their peak, they were hauling more than a tenth of everything Union Pacific moved. That number doesn't fit the story most people know about these locomotives. Which surprises you more, that they beat the diesels outright, or that almost nobody tells it that way. But the fuel was doing something to the machine while it worked. Residual fuel does not burn clean. Its ash carries sodium and vanadium, and those two went to work on the inside of the turbine, corroding the combustor and eating into the blades. A GTL had to come apart for a full overhaul every 4,000 to 5,000 hours. The machine that was cheapest to run was being consumed by the thing that made it cheap. None of that killed it. What killed it was something the turbine did when it was doing nothing at all. A piston engine and a turbine fail differently the moment you ask them for less power. A diesel throttles down, less fuel, fewer power strokes, less work done. Its efficiency curve is comparatively flat, so a diesel at half output is still a reasonably efficient diesel. A turbine does not behave that way. Its power output and its efficiency both drop as the shaft slows. They drop together and they drop hard. British engineers running the numbers on a coal-fired turbine in the same era measured the fall. 19% efficient at full load, 16% at half load, 10% at a tenth of load. Those are not Union Pacific's figures, and it is not the same machine. But the shape of that curve is the point, and the shape is the same on every gas turbine ever built. Now put that curve on a railroad. A freight train slows for a signal. It waits in a siding while an opposing move clears. It drifts downgrade with the throttle shut. It sits in a yard for an hour while a crew builds it. Across a run through Wyoming, the time a locomotive spends producing everything it has is a small fraction of the time it spends switched on. The turbine was magnificent in that fraction, and financially ruinous in all the rest. The Illinois Railway Museum owns one of the two survivors, and their description of the problem is blunt. The turbines used nearly as much fuel at idle as they did at full throttle, and railroads kept them running continuously once they had been lit. Lighting the turbine was a decision you did not casually reverse. And now, the second engine makes sense. Union Pacific did not run into this out on the road and improvise a fix. They knew before the first machine was delivered. That is why the Cooper-Bessemer appears in the specification from the factory on all 33rd generation units. The railroad designed around a flaw it never solved. Every big blow that ever turned a wheel carried a small diesel whose entire job was to do the things the big engine was too expensive to do. That is not a locomotive with an auxiliary engine. That is a confession bolted in and shipped 30 separate times. Even so, the arithmetic held for 15 years. The fuel was cheap enough to swallow the waste. Then the oil industry got better at its own job. Catalytic cracking improved through the 1960s. Refiners learned to break heavy residue down into lighter, more valuable products, and the plastics industry began buying up whatever was left over. Every barrel of crude was yielding less and less of the black sludge at the bottom. Union Pacific's fuel did not get expensive because somebody raised a price on them. It got expensive because it stopped being garbage. By the late 60s, the cost per horsepower of turbine fuel had crossed above the cost per horsepower of diesel. The single number the entire program was built on had flipped, and there was nothing anyone at Union Pacific could do about it. The retirements came in waves. 4 units in August of 1968, 1 more that autumn, 7 through the first half of 1969, and 4 more as the year closed. The last one ran on the 26th of December, 1969, Turbine 7, taking an eastbound manifest freight out of Cheyenne for North Platte. The final 14 were retired in February of 1970. 20 went back to General Electric in trade. 10 were sold to a leasing company in September of 1971. The trucks were pulled out from under them and bolted beneath new diesels, which is the detail I have the hardest time getting past. The largest locomotives ever built were taken apart for their running gear and used to help build their own replacements. 2 are left out of 55. UP-18 sits at the Illinois Railway Museum, cosmetically restored with no turbine inside it. UP-26 is at Ogden, described by the people who care for it as a shell. Nobody is restoring either one, and no plan exists to try. There is one more thing, and it is the part I cannot let go of. Everyone agrees on what did it. The museum says the idle problem. The railroad's own account blames the machine's appetite for fuel. It is the reason a second engine sits inside every one of them. But there is no number. Nobody at Union Pacific and nobody at General Electric ever published what a big blow actually burned standing still. The running figure survived, somewhere around 600 gallons an hour, roughly 360 feet of track for every gallon at an average of 33 miles an hour. The idle figure appears in no record anywhere. The most famous fact about the largest locomotive ever built is the one nobody bothered to write down. It was not beaten by a better locomotive. It was beaten by an oil refinery getting better at a job that had nothing to do with railroading. And once you start noticing that pattern, you find it behind almost every machine that quietly disappeared. That is what American Iron Works does. Subscribe so you catch the next one.